A little girl was left on the tracks with dead flowers and a note that said, "She eats too much." The note was pinned through the fabric with a sewing needle. That's what I keep coming back to, not a safety pin. A sewing needle, the kind with a small colored glass bead at the top, blue in this case, and whoever pinned it had taken the trouble to fold the paper twice before pushing it through the cloth of her dress so it wouldn't tear. That kind of care, for a note like that. I found her sometime in the middle of September, a Thursday if I remember right, though I've been wrong about that detail before. The morning was still cool, but you could feel what was coming under it, that dry West Texas heat that doesn't actually leave until November. It just retreats at night and comes back by 10 o'clock every morning with the same indifferent patience it's always had. I was walking the fence line on the east side, the stretch that runs parallel to the Missouri Pacific tracks, because I'd lost 2 calves that week to something that had come under the wire, and I wanted to see where. The calves had been found clean, not eaten, just dead, and that bothered me in a way I couldn't put a name to. Things that kill for food, I understand. Things that kill and leave it there, I don't. I smelled her before I saw her, not an unpleasant smell. Johnson's baby powder and something else, something like the inside of an old cedar chest, clothes kept folded in the dark. I came around the end of the section, and she was sitting on the rail, the west rail, not between the rails, which told me something, or I chose to believe it told me something, with her feet not quite reaching the gravel and both hands holding a bunch of wildflowers that had been dead for some time. Dried past wilting into something stiff and pale. She wasn't crying. She was looking down the tracks in the direction of Ozona, which was 12 miles southwest, and her expression was one I've seen on men a lot older than she was. Waiting for something that isn't coming, but waiting anyway because there's nothing else to do. She was 4 years old, maybe 5. Small either way. Her dress was yellow with a white collar, clean except for dust along the hem, and the note was pinned just below her left shoulder like a pocket handkerchief. I read it standing a few feet away. I didn't touch it for a minute. She'd heard me coming. Kids always hear things they don't look at, and she turned to look at me with brown eyes that were too still for her age. The note said she eats too much. Her name is Luz. That was all it said, those 2 sentences. The handwriting was a woman's, I thought, though I've been wrong about that, too. I crouched down so I wasn't standing over her and said, "Luz." She looked at me. "You hungry?" She thought about it like it was a real question that deserved consideration. Then she said yes. I reached out my hand and she looked at it for a moment, and then she put the dead flowers in it, transferring them to me with a kind of solemn ceremony. And then she took my hand instead of giving me hers back, and we walked toward the truck. I didn't know then what I was starting. I want to be honest about that. I thought I was doing a thing that needed doing and that by afternoon there would be someone from the county, or a relative, or something. I fed her eggs and toast and a glass of milk, and she ate it without saying much, and when she was done, she put the glass down carefully and wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, and looked at me like she was trying to figure something out. "You live here?" she said. "I do," I said. She looked around the kitchen. "By yourself?" "By myself." She considered this. She said, "My mama had somebody." I waited. "He left," she said. She picked up the toast crust she'd set aside and bit the end off it. "Mama said it's because of me." I got up and refilled my coffee and stood at the window with my back to her and looked at the flat and the tracks a quarter mile out and the sky above it all, which was the pale washed-out blue it gets in September, almost white at the horizon. I stood there long enough that she finished the toast crust and pushed the plate to the center of the table. "That wasn't true," I said. "Whatever she said, that wasn't true." She didn't answer. Maybe she believed me and maybe she didn't. She was 4 years old and someone had pinned a note to her dress with a sewing needle. Her mother, probably, her own mother. I drove into Dumas that afternoon to talk to Carla at the county office. Carla had been there 20 years and she knew me. My wife had died 8 years before, and in the years right after that I'd come to Carla for various pieces of paper, the kind of papers you need when someone dies and leaves things that need to be sorted. And she listened to what I told her, and then she looked at me over her reading glasses and said, "Earl, that child can't stay with you." "I know that," I said. "I'm not asking for permission to keep her. I'm asking you to find her people." Carla wrote some things down. She said there was a family down in Crockett County, maybe Sutton County. She'd look into it. She said it might take a few days given what they had going on. She didn't say what they had going on, but I had some idea. Something had been moving through that part of the country for about a month, something quiet, which was the worst kind, and the sheriff's office and whatever else was involved had been occupied with it. I'd heard things in town. A man found in a bar ditch outside of Sheffield. A family in Iran who'd come home to find their front door open and nothing taken and nobody inside, which sounds like nothing, but if you knew them, you'd know why people weren't sleeping. Things like that. I told Carla to call me when she had something. I drove back. Luz was asleep on the couch. She'd pulled the good blanket, the one my wife made, the blue and yellow one, off the back of it and wrapped herself up, and she was asleep with one fist under her chin. I stood in the doorway and looked at her, and then I went and sat in the kitchen and had a beer I didn't particularly want and read the same paragraph of the newspaper 4 or 5 times. She slept for 2 hours. When she woke up, she came to the kitchen doorway and stood there with the blanket around her shoulders like a cape and said, "Do you have a dog?" "No," I said. "Oh," she said, she thought about that. "I had a dog, he was brown." "What was his name?" "Dog," she said. I almost smiled. "That's a good name." Mama said it was a stupid name. "What did Dog think of it?" She considered this seriously. "He didn't say," she said. I put her in the spare room that night. I didn't have much in there, a bed, a lamp, a chest of drawers that still had some of my wife's things in the top drawer that I hadn't been able to move yet. She didn't seem bothered by the bareness of it. She got into the bed and lay there looking at the ceiling while I stood at the door. "I'll leave the lamp on," I said. "Okay," she said. She turned her head to look at me. "Are you scared of the dark?" "Not usually." "I'm not either," she said, "but I like the lamp." "Then we'll leave it on." She turned back to the ceiling. "Thank you," she said, the way you'd say it to someone who held a door open, small and plain and meaning it. I didn't sleep much. I lay in my own room and listened to the quiet and passed it to the things that move in West Texas at night: coyotes, wind, the occasional moan of the tracks settling, which sounds like a living thing if you're not used to it. Sometime around 2 in the morning, I got up and went down the hall and stood outside her door and listened and heard her breathing, slow and regular. I've been asked, not often, but sometimes, what kind of man takes in a child like that? What I felt, what I was thinking. I never know what to tell people. I was thinking about whether the fence on the east side was patched right. I was thinking the weather would change in a week or two, and I hadn't got to some things I needed to get to. I wasn't thinking in terms of fate or duty or anything like that. She was there and I was there, and she needed feeding and a bed, and I had both. That's the whole of it. But I'll say this, standing in that hallway at 2 in the morning, listening to her breathe, I felt something shift in the house itself. Like a window had been opened that had been painted shut a long time. Like air coming in that hadn't been there before. I stood there until I was sure I was being an old fool about it, and then I went back to bed. Carla called me Thursday of the following week. She'd found a grandmother in Del Rio, she said, but the grandmother was 81 and in a facility and couldn't take her. She was looking further. She said, "Is she all right where she is for now?" I said she was. "Any trouble?" "No," I said. There'd been a man in a truck on the road out front 2 days before, parked, just sitting. I'd watched him from the house for 20 minutes and then taken my rifle and walked out to the road, and by the time I got there, he was gone. A dark pickup, late model, Texas plates, but I hadn't gotten the number. It was probably nothing. There are a lot of trucks. I didn't tell Carla about the truck. There wasn't anything to tell exactly. What I did do was drive in to see Roy Briggs, who had been deputy sheriff for Crockett County for 30 years before retiring, and who knew the country and the people in it better than anyone I'd ever met. Roy was in his late 70s and spent most of his time in his shop making things out of leather. And he was there when I came by, working on a saddle, and he listened to what I told him and didn't look up from his work for most of it. When I finished, he said, "Man in a dark truck." "Probably nothing," I said. "Things moving through this country lately," he said, "aren't usually nothing." He set down his tool and looked at me. "The girl's name is Luz." "That's what the note said." "Martinez, her mother's name would be Irene Martinez. There was a man she was with, I heard about this from Dub-ests over in Sanderson, goes by different names. The family name that kept coming up was Cutter." He picked his tool back up. "If it's the same man I'm thinking of, Earl, he's not the kind who cares about a child one way or the other. But if the mother left a witness somewhere, even a small one." I sat with that. "Keep the girl inside," he said. And keep your rifle where you can get to it." On the way home, I stopped at the school, which was a single building on the edge of town that housed grades 1 through 8 because there weren't enough kids in Dumas for it to be otherwise. The teacher there was a woman named Helen Cole. I'd seen her around for about a year. She'd come from up near Amarillo to take the position when old Mr. Deering retired, but I didn't know her. She was in the classroom when I knocked, after the kids had gone home, cleaning the blackboard, and she turned around when I came in. She was maybe 45. Dark hair going gray at the temples, the kind of gray that comes in honest and stays. She had the look of someone who thought before she spoke, which I'd learned by then to consider a serious quality in a person. I told her about Luz and asked if she'd have a look at her, see if she could figure out what grade level made sense, whether she'd had any schooling. She said, "Where is she now?" "At my place, my ranch." She looked at me. "How long has she been there?" "9 days. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What's the county doing about placing her?" "Working on it," I said. "Maybe another week or 2. She set the eraser down on the chalk rail and turned fully to face me. She had a direct way of looking at you, not rude, just clear. "Why are you doing this?" she said. "Because she needed somewhere," I said. She looked at me a while longer. Then she said, "I'll come out tomorrow afternoon." She came out at 3 o'clock in a green Ford that had seen better years, and she sat at my kitchen table with Luz for an hour while I stayed out of the way. I could hear them through the window while I worked on the truck, Luz's voice flat and considering, Helen's patient and direct. And at some point Luz started laughing at something, a real laugh, the kind I hadn't heard from her yet, and I stopped what I was doing and held still for a second with a wrench in my hand. Helen came out to find me afterward. She stood in the sun and squinted toward the flats and said, "She's bright. Nobody taught her to read yet, but she wants to. She's been working things out on her own." A pause. "She told me she's not going to Del Rio." "She's 4, I said. "Almost 5, Helen said, "and she has opinions." She looked at me sideways. "She told me you're the only person who's been nice to her since her dog died." I went back to what I was doing with the wrench. Helen didn't leave right away. She sat on the porch steps with Luz and read to her from a book she'd brought, one of those illustrated ones with the bright covers, and Luz sat close beside her and tracked the words with one finger. I watched them from under the hood of the truck. The light was going amber and long by then. The flat turning colors the way it does in the late afternoon, and the tracks out east caught the sun and went bright as a knife blade. I brought them both iced tea, and Helen looked up at me when I handed her the glass and said, "Thank you, Earl." It was the first time she'd used my name. She came back the next Thursday, and the one after that. It was the 2nd week of October when I found the dead calf again. Same stretch of fence, east side near the tracks. No sign of entry, no blood, no tracks I could read in the hard ground, just the calf on its side, in the same posture as the ones before. I stood there with my hat in my hand, and studied the ground and the fence and the tracks beyond it for a long time. There were tire marks on the county road that runs alongside the Rytov Way, but that road gets traffic. It doesn't mean much. What bothered me was the dog. I had a neighbor's dog, Hennessy's Blue Heeler, who wandered my property regularly, and that dog would not come near the east fence anymore. Hadn't for 2 weeks. Dogs have a kind of knowledge about things that people have to reason their way to, and they get there faster. I patched the fence. I told myself it was a predator, maybe, something new in the area. Coyote big enough to take a calf and then, what, not eat it? I knew it wasn't that. I knew it wasn't anything I'd seen before which told me it was a person. A person making a point or checking something or looking for something. Looking for something small, maybe, that might be living in a yellow dress in my spare room. I talked to Roy again. Roy said there'd been an incident in Fort Stockton, something he didn't want to describe over the phone, and that it was the same kind of pattern and that what I'd told him fit. He said, "Is that woman still coming out to see the girl?" "Helen," I said, "yes." "Don't let her drive home alone after dark," he said. That night I moved my rifle from the closet to under the bed. I sat on the edge of the bed for a while in the dark. Outside, the flats were quiet and enormous, and the stars were hard and separate the way they get in October. I thought about my wife. I thought about the night she died, not the hard part, the ordinary part before it, when we sat on the porch after dinner and she'd said something that made me laugh. I don't even remember what now, and I'd laughed and she'd put her hand on my arm. Just that. Just her hand on my arm. I got up and walked down the hall and stood outside Luz's door and listened to her breathe. Helen had a reason for caution around men that she told me about in pieces over several weeks, always sideways, never sitting down to tell it plain. A marriage that ended badly. A man who'd had one version of himself in public and another at home. She'd been in Amarillo for the last year of it, teaching at a school there, saving money and waiting for a way out that wouldn't feel like defeat. And when the job in Dumas came up, she'd taken it and driven down with 2 suitcases and not looked back. She told me all of this as if it were weather factual past, not asking for anything. But I noticed that when I moved toward her for any reason, to hand her something, to pass behind her in the kitchen, ordinary things, she tracked it. Not with fear exactly, with attention, the way an animal does when it's been surprised before. I gave her room. It wasn't a strategy, it was just what seemed right. The 3rd Thursday she came, I'd made supper. Nothing elaborate, beans and cornbread and sliced tomatoes from what was left of the garden. And I set a place for her without asking, because by then it seemed assumed. And she came in from reading with Luz and washed her hands at the kitchen sink and sat down without comment. We ate and Luz told us about a dream she'd had involving a talking chicken, which she described with complete seriousness and in considerable detail. And Helen asked careful follow-up questions about the chicken's opinions on various topics. And I ate my beans and listened to the 2 of them and had the strange feeling I'd had somewhere before, some other version of this that I couldn't locate. After Luz was in bed, I walked Helen to her truck. The night was cooling fast the way it does in October, that switch that happens between 8 and 9 o'clock, and she had a sweater, but she was still cold. I could tell by the way she held her arms. She stood at the truck door and said, "Has the county come back to you?" "Last week," I said. "There's a great uncle in El Paso. They're trying to get a hold of him." She looked at me. "What will you do when she goes?" "Whatever I need to," I said. "That's not an answer." "No," I said, "I don't have one." She got in the truck. Then she rolled down the window and said, "You know the road from here to town is dark, and my headlights are not what they were." "I know," I said. "You don't need to follow me. I'm going to anyway." She was quiet. Then she started the truck, and I got in my own and followed her all the way to the edge of town, to the street where she had a small house behind the Baptist church. And she pulled into her drive, and I pulled to the curb, and she got out and stood by the truck, and I rolled my window down. She said, "Good night, Earl." "Good night," I said. She went in. I sat there a minute, engine running, looking at the lights come on inside the house, room by room, and then I drove home. The man came on a Tuesday night in the last week of October, when the temperature had finally broken for real, and there was a cold coming in off the northwest that smelled like the high desert. I heard him before I saw him, not footsteps. I was too far from the exterior for that, but the dog. Not my dog, I didn't have one, but Hennessy's blue heeler, who had finally come back around the property, was outside, and he started that low, steady bark that isn't alarm exactly, but something past it. Past alarm into something older. I was already awake. I'd been sleeping light for weeks. I got the rifle and went to the window. The moon was 3/4 full, and the flat was bright enough to read by almost, and the tracks were there, pale lines running to the horizon, and between the tracks and the house, at the edge where the gravel meets the yard, a man was standing. He was just standing, not moving toward the house, just standing there in the moonlight with his hands at his sides. I pulled on my boots and my coat. I checked the rifle. I went to Luz's room and said her name quietly, and she woke up fast. Kids in hard situations learn to wake up fast, and I said, "I need you to go under the bed." "Okay? Take the blanket and go under the bed and don't come out until I come back and say your name. You understand me?" She nodded. She said, "Is it Cutter?" I looked at her. "He came before," she said. Her voice was flat and small. "To the place we lived. Mama made me hide." "Under the bed," I said. "Don't make any noise." She got down under the bed. I went back to the kitchen, shut off the light, and went out the back door. I came around the south end of the house and stood in the shadow of the propane tank for a moment. The man was still there. He was tall, I could see that now, and thin, in a canvas jacket, and he was looking at the front of the house with the same patient waiting that I'd seen on Luz's face the morning I found her. It ran in my mind briefly that they were related by something other than blood, by the same kind of waiting, the same stillness in the face of something that couldn't be changed. Then he moved, not toward the house. He turned and looked along the south side, and I was in the shadow of the tank, and I didn't move, and after a moment he turned back, looking for something, looking for which window was hers, maybe, or looking to see if I was watching. I stepped out of the shadow. He saw me immediately. We were 30 feet apart. He looked at the rifle. I said, "There's no child here." He looked at me for a long time. His face was just a face, not marked by what he was, not unusual in any way I could point to. That's what Roy had said when I'd described him later. That's how they are. There's nothing particular in the face. He said, "You found her on the tracks." "Found a calf down on the east fence," I said. "3 of them, that was you." He was quiet. "To see if I'd look," I said. "To see how far my fence ran, to know the layout." He tilted his head slightly. Not an admission, just a recognition that I'd worked it out. "There's no child here," I said again. "She was with me for a week. County placed her with family in El Paso. She's been gone 3 weeks." This was a lie. She was under the bed behind me with my wife's blue and yellow blanket. He looked at me for what felt like a long time. His hands were still at his sides. I had the rifle loose in both hands, not raised, pointed down, and I was watching his hands, and he knew it, and we both knew what the next several seconds were. He made a decision. I saw it happen, some internal thing that reorganized his face by almost nothing. Then he turned and walked back toward the road. I stood there until I heard a truck start up on the county road, the direction I couldn't see from the house, and pull away. I stood there another 5 minutes after that, listening, watching the flat. Then I went inside. Luz was under the bed. I lay down on the floor and looked at her. She was holding the blanket up around her chin with both fists. "He's gone," I said. She looked at me. "He believed me," I said. "He usually does," she said. Her voice was still flat. "When he thinks he's already won." I lay there on the floor looking at her for a moment. Then I said, "Come on out." She scooted out and I picked her up and she sat in my arms and put her face against my neck and didn't cry. Just sat there breathing. She was small. I'd never had children of my own and I'd forgotten or never known how small a child that age actually is, how little they weigh, and yet how heavy. I held her until she went still, and then I put her back in the bed and sat in the chair in the corner until I was certain she was asleep. I called Roy in the morning. He listened, and then he said he'd make some calls, and I was not to be surprised if some people I'd never met showed up in the next few days with questions. He said, "He'll go now. If he thinks he's wrong about where the girl is, he'll spend his energy somewhere else." "For how long?" I said. "Long enough," Roy said. "Maybe for good. Men like that don't fixate unless there's something to fixate on. If there's no girl here, there's no reason to be here." "And if he doesn't believe me?" "Then you did what you had to do," Roy said. "And you were ready for it. That's all any man can do." Helen came that Thursday, and I told her what had happened. We were in the kitchen and Luz was outside in the yard, within sight through the window, and Helen sat with her hands folded on the table and listened to all of it without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "You didn't call anyone that night?" "Roy in the morning," I said. "That was all it needed." "You could have called me." "It was 2 in the morning," I said. She looked at me. "I wouldn't have cared," she said. I got up and refilled my coffee and stood at the window and looked at Luz out in the yard. She was crouching over something in the dirt, a bug, maybe, or a rock, something that required close attention. She had her head down and her hair falling over her face and her hands braced on her knees, and she was completely absorbed. Helen came and stood beside me. We stood there watching Luz together. The window was warm from the sun on the glass, and outside the flat was its usual color, the pale, dry brown of late October, and the tracks east were just visible from where we stood. After a while, Helen said, quietly, without looking at me, "I want to tell you something." I waited. "I have been careful," she said, "for a long time about men, about deciding what kind of man something was." A pause. "I've been wrong before. I've been sure I was right and I was wrong." "Most people have," I said. "I'm not wrong about you," she said. I looked at her. She was looking at Luz. "I've been watching you for 2 months," she said. "The way you are with her, the way you were with what happened Tuesday night. The way you are in general." She turned and looked at me then directly the way she did. "I'm not wrong about you." I didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say that would improve it. She reached out and put her hand on my arm, my forearm just below the elbow where my sleeve was rolled up. Her hand was warm and her grip was certain. Not the tentative touch of someone testing, the grip of someone who decided. We stood like that for a moment. Outside, Luz stood up and stretched her arms over her head and then crouched back down over her rock or her bug. Helen said, "I'd like to keep coming on Thursdays." "I'd like that too," I said. She didn't take her hand away. We stood at the window and watched the child in the yard, and the flat beyond her and the sky above all of it, which was the hard, clear blue of a day with a cold coming but no clouds yet. The great uncle in El Paso turned out to be a real person, a man named Vicent, 70 years old and still working, who drove up in November to meet Luz. He was a quiet man with calloused hands, and he sat at my kitchen table and talked to Luz for 2 hours in Spanish, of which I understood enough to follow. And Luz sat across from him and looked at him with that assessing look of hers and asked him, at one point, whether he had a dog. He did not. She told him she would teach him to get one. He looked at her over the table with eyes that were filling up, and he said something in Spanish I didn't catch. And Luz reached across and patted his hand twice in a way that was so adult, so plainly something she'd learned from watching grown women do it, that I had to look at the window. He took her in December. Helen drove out that morning and we stood in the yard while Vicent's truck loaded up, and Luz went through the business of leaving with the same contained seriousness she brought to everything. She hugged Helen for a long time, both arms around her waist. Then she came to me and looked up. I crouched down. She put her arms around my neck and I put my hand on her back and she said, close to my ear, "You're a good man, Earl." She said it the way she'd said thank you that first night, small and plain and meaning it. I held on to her for a moment. Then she pulled back and looked at me and I said, "Vicent's going to take care of you." "I know," she said. She stood up. She said, "I'm going to write you a letter. Helen will help me." "I'd like that," I said. She got in the truck. Vicent shook my hand and thanked me in a way that wasn't comfortable for either of us but was honest. And then he got in and the truck went down the ranch road and turned onto the county road and was gone. Helen and I stood in the yard. The air was cold and still. The flat was gray and brown, the color it turns when winter finally gets here to stay, and the tracks east were empty in both directions. She didn't say anything comforting. She didn't say anything at all for a while. Then she said, "She'll write." "I know she will," I said. "She will also ask you to get a dog in the letter." I almost smiled. "Probably," I said. We went inside. I made coffee and we sat at the kitchen table, the one where Luz had eaten eggs that first morning and told me about her dog named Dog. And we drank coffee and talked about things that weren't Luz, Helen's classroom, a fence repair I had coming up, the weather, ordinary things. And the kitchen was warm and the flat outside the window was gray and the tracks were empty and the house was quiet in the way it had been before she came. But not the same kind of quiet. There are things I've thought about since then, things I come back to when I'm out on the flat or in the barn or lying awake in the early morning before it's properly light. I think about the man who stood in the moonlight. Roy had been right, more or less. There were some people from places I didn't need to know about who came and asked questions, and there was talk of something being resolved, though I never got a clear picture of what that meant. What I know is that after the middle of November, nothing moved through that part of the country that made the air feel wrong. The blue heeler came back to the east fence without concern. I think about Irene Martinez. I don't know what happened to her. I asked Carla and Carla said she didn't know either and I believed her. I hope she's somewhere that she can eat as much as she wants and nobody pins a note to her telling her it's a problem. I don't know enough about her to grieve her properly, but I think about her. I think about the note, the sewing needle, the blue glass bead, the fold in the paper, that care. Helen comes out most weekends now. In March, she started leaving a toothbrush at the house. I didn't comment on this and she didn't explain it. There are things that don't need to be said out loud to be true. She is not an easy woman. She has opinions and she states them, and sometimes they're wrong and she knows when they are and acknowledges it without too much theater, and sometimes they're right, and she doesn't need to labor the point either way. She says what she thinks about the things I do, and she's as often right about that as she is about other things. I've learned to listen when she's talking even when what she's saying isn't comfortable. I don't know what she sees in me exactly. I'm past 60, I've got bad knees and a ranch that runs more on habit than on profit, and I don't have a lot to say on most evenings. But she's told me not once, not as reassurance, just as fact, the way she says most things, that she trusts me, that she knows what I am, that she knew it by watching me crouch down on the railroad tracks and take a child's dead flowers from her hand. Last month a letter came from El Paso. It was in two handwritings, Luz's, which was large and careful and crooked, sounding out words she was still learning, and Vicent's, which filled in the spaces where she ran out of vocabulary. She had gotten a dog. His name was Pero, she wrote, which made me put the letter down on the table for a moment. She was doing well in school. She was learning to read, really read, not just finger-tracing words. She said the teacher in El Paso wasn't as good as Miss Helen, but she was all right. She said she thought about me sometimes when she was going to sleep. Helen was there when I read it. She was at the table with papers she'd brought from school, and she looked up when I set the letter down, and she could tell from something in my face what it was, and she reached across the table and put her hand over mine. Outside the window the flat ran all the way to nothing. The tracks caught the evening light, the way they always do at that hour, bright and still and going to the horizon. The sky above them was the particular red of late March, that color that only lasts about 8 minutes before the dark comes, the kind of red that costs something to look at directly. Helen's hand on mine, the kitchen warm, the flat outside going red then dark, that's the picture I keep. A man I knew years ago told me that the things worth having in this life don't usually announce themselves. They come in sideways. They come in on a Thursday afternoon with a book and a green Ford that needs new headlights. They come in with dead flowers and brown eyes that are too still for their age. They come in small and quiet, and they change the shape of the house. I didn't know what I was starting that September morning on the east fence. I want to be honest about that. But I knew what I had before long. I knew it by the weight of it. I've got the kind of good sense that takes a while to arrive, but it gets there. The light went out of the sky. Helen took her hand back and looked at her papers, and I made more coffee, and we sat in the kitchen while the dark came down outside over the flat, and the tracks, and the long, particular emptiness of that country. The emptiness that is nothing like being empty, once you know what's in it. I want to go back to October because I told it too fast. The 3 weeks between when I first drove to Carla and when the man showed up in the moonlight were the longest 3 weeks I'd had in some time, and I don't mean that badly. I mean they had the quality of length that things have when something is happening in them, when something is changing at a pace that's faster than you're used to, but slower than panic. Luz had been alone a lot before she came to me. I understood that without her saying it, just from watching her. The way she occupied herself. The way she could sit for an hour with a stick and a patch of dirt and be entirely engaged with it, entirely inside whatever she was doing without looking up to see if anyone was watching. You learn that kind of self-sufficiency from being alone. Nobody taught it to her as a virtue. It was just what you did when there was nobody there. What changed slowly was that she started looking up. Not at me, well at me, but not looking for something, just looking. The way you look at furniture you've decided to keep. I'd be at the stove and I'd turn around and she'd be sitting at the table watching me work, not with any particular expression, just watching. Or I'd be out in the yard and I'd come in and she'd be at the window and she'd track me from the yard to the door with that steady brown gaze. It wasn't unnerving. It was actually, I don't have a better word for it, it was actually restoring something. To be seen in the ordinary mechanics of a day by someone who was paying attention. My wife had done that. After she died, I didn't realize for a long time how much of what I did every day I'd done with the sense of being seen, of having a witness, not performing, just not being alone. Luz was a good witness. She noticed things. She told me one morning that I always held my coffee cup with both hands even when it was cool enough to hold with one. And I looked down at my hands, and she was right, and I hadn't known that about myself. We got into a routine without trying. Breakfast together. She'd sit at the table and I'd cook, and she'd talk about dreams she'd had or things she'd been thinking about, or she'd ask me questions that were sometimes easy and sometimes not. She asked me one morning why the sky wasn't orange if the sun was orange, and I told her what I knew about light and atmosphere, which wasn't much, and she listened with the air of someone who was going to look into this further. She asked me another morning whether I'd ever been scared. I said yes. She asked of what. I thought about it and said, of losing people. She nodded at that like it confirmed something she'd been working out. She asked me once about my wife. I don't know how she knew there'd been a wife. Maybe something in the house told her, the blue and yellow blanket maybe, or the things in the top drawer of the chest in her room that I still hadn't moved. I told her her name had been Marguerite and that she'd been good at most things and better than most people at being in a room with you without making you feel watched. Luz thought about this and said, "Like you." I said, "I don't know about that." She said, "You don't make me feel watched." I told her that was probably because I tried not to. She said, "Cutter watches. Even when he's not there, it feels like he's watching." I waited. "Mama called it a gift," she said. Her voice was flat when she said it, a child's assessment of something adult and ugly. She said some people are just gifted that way. I didn't say anything, because anything I said would have been about her mother, and I didn't know her mother and didn't have the right. "I think it's not a gift," Luz said. "No," I said, "it's not." She picked up her juice glass. "I'm glad I'm here," she said, not with emotion, just as a statement of position. Then she drank her juice. "I should say something about the town, because the town is part of what this is." Dumas was small. Ranching community, some farming, a population that had been shrinking since before I got there because the young people left and didn't come back much. The people who stayed were mostly people who'd been there a long time, people whose families had ranched or farmed the same ground for generations. And there was a kind of social order that was stable the way a piece of old rope is stable, worked fine if you didn't put too much weight on it. A man alone doesn't get much scrutiny in a place like that. A man alone with a child gets considerably more. It wasn't unfriendly. People in Dumas were not unfriendly on the whole. But there were comments at the feed store and at Patsy's Diner where I ate lunch a couple of times a week, and they were the kind of comments that are almost questions and almost concerns, but are actually just a community asserting its right to know your business. I understood it. I would have been the same. What I noticed was that the comments changed after Helen started coming out on Thursdays. Not immediately, but after she'd been coming for 2 or 3 weeks, the quality of the attention shifted. I couldn't say exactly how, something in the phrasing. Helen was respected in Dumas. She was a good teacher, and she had the kind of reserve that people read as character rather than coldness, and I think her association with what I was doing changed how people read it, made it legible in a way it hadn't been before. There were 1 or 2 people who said things to me that were meant to be about Helen, but were actually about me. About my being too old, about it being a fool's notion, about her being too good for a dried-up rancher living alone out on the East Flat. One of those people was Dan Mabry at the feed store, who I'd known for 30 years and who thought he was looking out for me. I told him thank you. I didn't tell him anything else. I didn't tell him because I didn't have language for it yet. I didn't have language for what Helen and I were, partly because I wasn't sure, and partly because I'd learned from Marguerite that the things worth having don't always need language right away. Sometimes you can just be in the thing for a while. What I knew was that Helen was changing the shape of the days. She came on Thursdays, and the days before Thursday had a different quality than the days after. Not better or worse exactly, just oriented differently, pointed in a direction. She'd sit with Luz and read, and then she'd sit at the table and have coffee, and we'd talk about ordinary things. She was from up near Canyon originally, a small town herself, ranching family. She'd left for college and come back to the Panhandle in her 30s, which she described as something between surrender and wisdom. She decided that surrender and wisdom were sometimes the same thing. She had a quality that I don't have a word for. It was something like ease but not laziness. She could be still. She could sit in a quiet room and not feel compelled to fill it. I'd known a lot of people who couldn't do that, who turned silence into something anxious and chattery, and I'd learned to keep some distance from those people because they wore me out. Helen was still. She could sit with a cup of coffee, and the sounds of Luz in the other room and the flat outside the window and just be in it, the way you're in a place that already makes sense. That stillness was what I trusted first. Before I trusted anything else about her, I trusted that. The week before the man came, something happened that I didn't tell anyone. I was driving back from Roy's place in the early evening, heading out of town on the county road when I saw Luz's school from the road. The lights were on in the building, and Helen's green Ford was in the lot, and there was another truck beside it that I didn't recognize, dark, not running. I slowed down. The other truck was just sitting there. I drove past slowly, and the driver's window was dark and I couldn't see inside. I turned around down the road and came back, and when I passed again, the truck was still there and still dark. I pulled into the lot, parked behind Helen's truck, got out. The door of the school was unlocked, and I went in. Helen was in her classroom with a man I didn't know, 30s, heavyset, the kind of polite face that doesn't tell you anything. And she looked up when I came in, and something in her eyes said she was glad I was there, which told me something about the man. He was from the county, he said. Child welfare. Looking into the placement of the Martinez girl, making sure everything was proceeding correctly. I said I'd been in contact with Carla at the county office, and she hadn't said anything about anyone coming to see the teacher. He said sometimes things fell through the cracks. I said I'd call Carla right now if he'd give me 1 minute. He said that wasn't necessary. I said I thought it was. I stepped into the hallway and called Carla at home, because it was past business hours. Carla picked up on the third ring, and I described the man, and she said she didn't know who I was talking about, and she hadn't sent anyone. I went back in the classroom, and the man was still there, standing with his hands in his jacket pockets. I said, Carla doesn't know you. He said there must be some confusion. I said there wasn't, not on my end. I said it would be a good idea for him to drive back wherever he'd come from, and I said it the way I say things that I mean, which is without much inflection, and he looked at me for a moment, and then he said something about being in touch, and he left. Helen sat down in her chair when he was gone. She looked at the desk surface in front of her for a moment. Thank you, she said. He say anything to you before I came in? He asked about her routine, she said. When she was home, when she was here, whether she went anywhere on her own. You didn't tell him anything. She looked up at me. I'm not a fool, Earl. No, I said, you're not. She looked back at her desk. Then she said, I'd like to follow you home tonight. I looked at her. I'd like to know she's safe, she said. I won't stay, I just want to see her. I said that was fine. She drove out behind me and came in, and Luz was at the table drawing. She'd started drawing lately elaborate pictures of animals and landscapes, with a concentration and seriousness that was almost alarming, and she looked up when Helen came in and said, Helen, with that flat, pleased tone she had for things she approved of. Helen sat down and looked at the drawing for a while and asked questions about the various animals in it, and I made coffee and stood at the window. Helen left at 9. I walked her to the truck, and she stood with her hand on the door and said, Something's coming. I think so, I said. She looked at me. You'll be ready. It wasn't a question, and it wasn't just reassurance either. She said it the way you say something you know to be true, the way you state a fact about the physical world. I said I would. She got in the truck. She said, call me tomorrow. I said I would. She drove away. I went inside. That was the Thursday before the Tuesday he came. After the man in the moonlight, after he turned and walked back to the road, and the truck started up and went away, I sat at the kitchen table until nearly 4 in the morning. Not thinking, or thinking in the loose way you think when you're sitting in the dark after something, thoughts moving slow and disconnected. I thought about the note, the blue bead on the sewing needle. I thought about Irene Martinez pinning that note to her daughter's dress and leaving her on the tracks, whether it was an act of desperation or calculation or both, what she knew about what was coming, what she thought might happen when someone found her. I thought it must have taken everything she had. I thought she must have loved her daughter in a way that was bigger than anything else she was capable of to do that, to put that note on her. I thought about Luz saying when she heard the truck outside, "Is it Cutter?" Not afraid, not even particularly upset, just identifying it the way you identify weather, something you know is coming sometimes, something that comes and then goes. What kind of life is that for a child to have already learned? 4 years old. I thought about my wife, Marguerite, and the way she used to say that some things that looked like wounds from the outside were actually something else, not strength exactly, but something in the neighborhood of it. The thing that grows in the place where you don't have a choice about whether to be hurt. She'd said this about herself, about something in her own childhood I won't repeat here. She'd said it calmly, the way she said most things. Luz had that thing in the neighborhood of strength. She hadn't asked for it, and she'd probably have preferred to be without it, but she had it. The sun came up at some point, and I was still at the table. I got up and made coffee and went and listened outside Luz's door. She was still asleep. I went back to the kitchen and called Roy. He listened to everything I told him, and then he said, "He believed you." "I think so," I said. "You think or you know?" I thought about the man's face, the way the decision moved through him. I said. Roy said, that's enough. It has to be enough. He was right. That was all there was. You do what you can and then you wait to see if it was enough, and you're ready if it wasn't. That's the whole of it. I've never understood people who expect more certainty than that. Helen called at 8. She said, Earl. I said, he came last night. She was quiet. He's gone, I said. We're fine, Luz is fine. Another quiet, then she said, I'm coming out. She came out at noon. Luz was up by then, had been up since 7, was sitting at the kitchen table with her drawings again like nothing had happened. And when Helen came in, she got up and went to her, and Helen crouched down and looked at her face and said something too quiet for me to hear, and Luz looked back and said something too, and then she went back to her drawing. Helen straightened up. She looked at me across the kitchen. You're all right, she said. I'm fine, I said. She crossed the kitchen and stood in front of me and looked at me the way she looked at things she was assessing, directly, without apology, reading what was actually there rather than what she might prefer. She reached up and put her hand along the side of my face. Just that, her palm against the side of my face. The way you'd do if you were checking a child for fever, but not that at all. Something much more considered than that. I stood still. She said, I know what you did last night. I know what that cost. It didn't cost much, I said. She shook her head slightly, not disagreeing exactly, more like setting that aside. I know what kind of man stands in the dark alone to keep someone safe, she said. Her voice was quiet. I know what kind of man it takes. I didn't say anything. I know what kind of man you are, she said. She took her hand back. She went and sat down at the table across from Luz and said, Show me what you're drawing. And Luz explained the drawing with the same seriousness she always brought to it, and I stood at the counter and looked at them both. Outside the window, the flat was brown and still and ordinary. The tracks ran east to the horizon. The sky above them was high and clear, the blue it gets in late October when the weather has finally decided something. All ordinary, all exactly the same as it had been the day before. The kitchen was warm. There are a few more things. Vicent sent a photograph in February, a month after Luz went to live with him. She was in a backyard I didn't recognize, standing in the sun, and she was holding a dog, a brown dog, medium-sized, with the sleepy, dignified look that some dogs have. And she was looking at the camera with that same assessing gaze she'd had since the morning on the tracks, but something in it was different. Lighter. The way a face is lighter when the thing it was braced against is gone. She'd named the dog Earl. I told Helen about this, and she put her face against my shoulder and laughed, and I felt her laughing more than I heard it, and I stood there with my hand on her back and let it happen. There's a morning that comes back to me. This past spring, a Sunday, when Helen had stayed the night, she does most weekends now, and I got up early the way I always do, and she was still asleep, and I made coffee and took it to the porch and sat in the chair there and looked out over the flat. The sun was coming up behind the house, the light moving out over the flat in the gradual way that doesn't look like movement, but is, and the tracks east were catching it. Helen came out 20 minutes later with her own coffee, her hair down, wearing one of my flannel shirts over her clothes, and she sat in the other chair and didn't say anything. We sat for a while in the quiet. The light moved on the flat. A hawk worked a thermal above the tracks, that slow, unhurried circle. She said after a while, What are you thinking about? The girl, I said, Luz, the morning I found her. She was quiet. The flowers she was holding, I said. They were dead, but she was holding them anyway. Helen looked at the flat. I've thought about that a lot, I said. Why she was holding them. Helen said maybe her mother gave them to her. I hadn't thought of that. I sat with it. If Irene Martinez had given them to her, had put dead flowers in her hands before she left her on the tracks, then maybe she'd picked them somewhere and carried them until they were dead because she didn't have anything else to give. Or maybe she'd wanted her daughter to have something to hold, something for her hands. I said maybe. Helen looked at me then. The light was full now and it was on her face, that clear spring light, and she looked at me with that direct gaze she had, that looking at what's actually there. She said, You gave her something to hold. I looked at the flat. That's what you did, she said. When you found her, you gave her your hand. The hawk above the tracks tipped its wings and slid sideways on the air and was gone behind the rise. The flat went on. The tracks went to the horizon, the way they always had, the way they'd been before any of this started. Helen put her foot against mine. Not a gesture, just contact. She was there and I was there, and the morning was doing what mornings do out on that flat, just coming, just being itself, just the light and the ground and the long, quiet distance of it. I put my hand on her knee. She put her hand over mine. The day came on. I want to say something about Roy Briggs because he deserves it. He came out to the ranch in December, a week after Luz left with Vicent, ostensibly to check on a land question we'd been talking about for years, a corner marker on my north property that had never been exactly clear, but really, I think, to check on me. Roy was like that. He went about caring about people sideways, through practical business, through favors that were really just visits dressed up as something that needed doing. We walked the north fence line together in the cold, and he talked about the marker, and we found it and agreed on where it was. And then we walked back, and I made coffee, and he sat at the kitchen table in the chair where Luz used to sit. He said, "Quiet now." "Yes," I said. "That woman's still coming out," he meant Helen. "Most weekends," I said. He wrapped both hands around the coffee mug, the way I always did, though I hadn't thought about it until Luz pointed it out and looked at the window. He said, "Edna asks about you sometimes." Edna was his wife, who I'd known for 30 years. "Tell her I'm fine," I said. "She'll ask if you're eating." "Tell her I'm eating fine." Roy nodded. He drank his coffee. Then he said, "You did right by that girl." I looked at the table. "I've known a lot of men," Roy said. "Over a long career, you see people in all kinds of situations and you think you know what they'll do before they do it, and mostly you're right, but every so often you're wrong in the good direction." He set his mug down. "You were the good direction." I said, "I didn't do anything particular." "No," he said. "That's right. You just did the thing that was in front of you." He picked up his mug again. "That's the whole of it, mostly. People who wait for the situation where they can be particularly brave or particularly good, they usually miss the ones that actually matter. The ones that matter don't announce themselves. They just sit on the railroad tracks in a yellow dress." We sat with that for a minute. "Helen Cole is a good woman," he said. "She is," I said. "Edna will want to have you both to dinner." "I'll tell Helen." He got up and put on his coat, and I walked him to his truck, and we shook hands and he drove away, and I stood in the cold and watched him go, and then went inside. The kitchen was quiet. Luz's chair was empty. But the kitchen wasn't the same kind of empty it had been before she came, and I knew it wouldn't go back. Some things change the shape of a space permanently. Some things, a child's voice in the morning, the particular weight of trust that gets handed to you without ceremony. Some things mark you in ways you didn't ask for and wouldn't undo. I filled my coffee cup and sat down in my own chair and looked at the flat through the window. The light was going flat and gray the way it does in December, no drama to it, just the long, even gray of winter. I thought, Helen comes on Saturday. And that was enough, that was plenty.